nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Murakedato Vande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopal Patadasa Raghunath Hey Chai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Haite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadanastrinam Dantair Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Yeṣām Janma Janmani Avirapali Patiputra Kanta Swadasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Durdanta Matsvanta Durdanta Hai Churastam Raganugami bhajano lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya sahasara smaratam brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasam me Chittam Satam Marukari Yatupada Padme Yaramya Nikilaga Sangashamani Shotratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana Prayojanavatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on the earth, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we'll absorb ourselves in discussion of Padyavali. So we're in the Bhakta Mahatmya Prakaranam, the section on the greatness of Bhaktas. And in our last reading, we discussed how a Bhakta is pranamya, or is fit to be offered obeisance to, and therefore is great. In other words, honor is given to what is honorable. So if Bhaktas are said to be fit to be honored, that means they have the characteristic of honorability, or greatness, something that is worthy of being honored. So we heard a list of many great Bhaktas, and we discussed some of the characteristics of some among them who are lesser known. And we also heard that these Bhaktas attain the supreme spiritual object that can possibly be attained, Swayam Bhagavan himself, and they may do so by a variety of means. Any one of the 9 or other types of bhakti that are described by Prahlad Maharaj in the Bhagavatam. We heard a verse which illustrates how a particular great bhakta achieved Bhagavan by means of just that limb. So today we'll proceed in this prakaran to hear more about the greatness of bhaktas. So we come to verse 54. Next, the compiler cites a verse that describes the greatness of modern bhaktas, meaning the bhaktas mentioned in the two verses in the past, these are all what you might call Puranic bhaktas, or bhaktas that are mentioned throughout the Puranas and other scriptures. So now he's going to speak about a verse which mentions the greatness of bhaktas that aren't necessarily mentioned in the Puranas or mentioned in the ancient lore, but may exist in more modern times. So, a verse that describes the greatness of modern bhaktas by stating that they experience symptoms of ecstasy, or sattvika vikaras, as a result of just hearing Sri Bhagavan's name. So, it's one thing to be moved with intense feeling when one experiences the fullness of something. But it's another thing to be moved with feeling to experience even what can be considered the most remote or slight touch of something. That shows that something is far more wonderful, or also it can show that the person having this experience has far more greater regard. In other words, if someone were to have, the direct darshan of Bhagavan and see him perform some extraordinary feat, such as that there's an extremely evident expression of adbhutatva, or some astonishing thing, then someone may become moved with great feeling. But were it not for that particularly astonishing feat that were performed, the person might not have felt that way. Whereas to say that someone is moved with intense feeling, what to speak of seeing Bhagavan perform some astonishing feat, not even seeing him, but just hearing his name, that just even the slightest reminder of him is enough to move someone with such great feeling, then this shows that really they have such profound adoration for Bhagavan. So this is a greatness of bhaktas, or one greatness of the bhaktas is the intensity of their nishtha, the intensity of their bhav for Bhagavan, such that they can be moved to a state of great feeling, even by being slightly reminded of him, or even just by hearing his name. So the present verse describes this. Tebhyo namo'stu bhava-vāridhi-jīrṇa-paṅka saṁlagna-mokṣaṇa-vicakṣaṇa-pādukebhyaḥ kṛṣṇeti varṇa-yugala-śravaṇena yeṣām ānandathur bhavati nartita-roma-vṛndaḥ. May my obeisance be offered unto they whose sandals are adept at rescuing those stuck in the putrid mud of the ocean of material existence. They who become blissful and whose body hair begins dancing upon hearing the pair of phonemes, Kṛṣ-ṇa. So I'll read it one more time. May my obeisance be offered unto they whose sandals are adept at rescuing those stuck in the putrid mud of the ocean of material existence. They who become blissful and whose body hair begins dancing upon hearing the pair of phonemes, Kṛṣ-ṇa. So the commentator doesn't say a whole lot about this verse. He just makes a couple of points. Quote, the mud of the ocean of material existence represents the effects of ignorance of Sri Bhagavan and the true self. And this mud is described as putrid, or jirna, to convey that the effects of ignorance tightly hold on to those who become stuck within them. So, we hear often this analogy of the ocean of material existence. But we don't often hear so much of the idea that it also has putrid mud within it, or along its bank. So this is, you could say, an ornamentation by adding a degree of detail to a common analogy. And moreover, it's one thing to be stuck in mud, But it's another thing to be stuck in putrid mud, if anyone's had that experience, which I have on occasion. It's far less pleasant. So, he takes it that this, being stuck in the mud, in other words, being not only in an unpleasant or a difficult situation, but one that's difficult to get out of, and which is, you could say, stinky and highly unpleasant at the same time, he compares the state of ignorance that people live in within samsara to that. In other words, it's not that they're just stuck in a place that they can't get out of, and that they're in an undesirable place that's far from where one would desire to be, namely at the feet of Bhagavan, but that it's putrid, or in other words, that there's all these, very unpleasant elements going on in one's midst. In other words, the material world is full of, all this anger and jealousy and fighting and, bitterness and all these other things going on in one's midst. But the fundamental root, or the fundamental thing that perpetuates all of that, is ignorance of Bhagavan. This is Jiva Goswami's point in the Priti Sandarbha, where he's, you could say, summarizing the existential condition of a jiva who's been bound beginninglessly in samsara by saying, doshamulam hi jivasya, what is it? Anadi, I forget that phrase. Anyway, a well-known statement of Jiva Goswami where he says, the fundamental defect that is you could say, the instrumental cause in the jiva being bound in samsara is ignorance of Bhagavan, or obliviousness of Bhagavan. So the commentator, you could say, is applying that principle to this verse. Then it's sounds a little bit unusual in English, but it's a common feature of Sanskrit poetry to speak of not just a person, but even some of the paraphernalia of a person as having a particular capability in order to indicate that the capability of a person is even greater than that. So by saying, let me give my obeisance unto they whose sandals can rescue someone from the ocean of material existence, it might sound a little bit odd, or you might not, but the idea is that bhakta is far more capable than that. In other words, a bhakta has many capabilities which exceed just rescuing someone from material existence. Just their sandals can do that, or even things that just come in touch with the dust of their feet. Even those things have the ability to do that. In other words, the purifying effect of even what is conventionally considered contaminating, namely dust. The feet of the Vaishnava are so purifying, the proximity, the association of a Vaishnava is so purifying, even that which is conventionally contaminating is considered purifying. So now here, this author is going a step further and saying, and even those things that touch that dust, or that retain the presence of that dust, namely these sandals, they also have such capability. So what he wants to illustrate is thus that it's more or less effortless for these bhaktas. In other words, bhaktas that are completely steeped in bhakti to Bhagavan, just by their company, just by their speech, just by being in their midst, one will, become freed from this ignorance which perpetuates one's entanglement in samsara, because every act, every feature of that bhakta's activities are completely one-pointedly fixed upon Bhagavan, and thus direct one who's influenced by them towards Bhagavan and out of that ignorance. But in addition to this, a second point is described, that these bhaktas, in other words, effortlessly or without even, as a secondary element, they can liberate others from samsara, and moreover they are such that they become blissful even to hear Krishna's name. So to say that their body hair begins dancing is an ornamental way of describing horripilation, or the state of the hair standing on end, which Rupa Goswami classifies as one of the 8 types of sattvika bhavas, or the particular responses that arise in a bhakta as a result of experiencing rasa, which take place by the natural functioning of the psyche involuntarily or without volitional effort on the part of the person. So this Rupa Goswami makes different categories: anubhavas, sattvika bhavas, vyabhachari bhavas. What's the difference? In the case of sattvika bhavas, these are things that occur as a result of transformations that arise in the psyche, which are involuntary. In other words, it's not that the person is thinking, let my hair stand on end now, and then does that voluntarily. Rather, it just happens to them. It just comes about. So this is why it's classified as a sattvika bhava as opposed to an anubhava like dancing or what have you. So therefore, the bhakta is not just dancing, the body hair is dancing. And how? Just upon hearing these two phonemes, Kṛṣ-ṇa. So naturally, we're reminded of the compiler's own verse, speaking in praise of Krishna's, these two syllables, Kṛṣ-ṇa, tunde tondavani vitum vitunate tondavali labdaye, karna krodi vijayate gote, shrotarbi. I'm forgetting it now. Chitta sang prasangini vijayate sarvendriyanam kritim no jane janita kiyamritabhi kṛṣṇeti varṇa-yugala-śravaṇena. That I do not know what nectar is there in these two syllables, Kṛṣ-ṇa, that when they enter the ears, they inspire the desire for crores of ears. When they come upon the tongue, they inspire the desire for innumerable tongues. When they come within the courtyard of the heart, they capture all of the senses. So Rupa Goswami praised the glory or the nectar of Krishna's name in this way, to the great satisfaction of Haridas Thakur, Rai Ramananda, Swarup Damodar, Gauranga Mahaprabhu himself. So this verse can be considered, perhaps obviously was known to Rupa Goswami Pad, perhaps, was something he had come across prior to writing his own verse, might have even been something that had inspired his own poetry, who knows. In any case, the idea is to convey the intensity of the bhakta's bhav for Bhagavan by indicating that that bhav can be, aroused to a state of producing these sattvika bhavas, even, at hearing Krishna's name, or even with a slight cause of vivid cognition of Krishna. So in this way, bhakta's greatness is shown. All right, then I'll come to the next verse. Next, the compiler depicts the greatness of bhaktas by presenting an appeal made with lamentation to Prithvi Devi by a seeker of moksha intent upon sayuja mukti, who feels himself to be sorely devoid of bhakti and nothing more than a burden upon Prithvi Devi, after observing the bhavas that bhaktas express upon remembering Sri Bhagavan, hearing his name, and so on. So, a person pursuing another object, but when he sees these bhaktas, he's so moved that he has this brand new or profound recognition or adoration for bhaktas, such that he expresses the following. hari-smṛtyāhlāda-stimita-manaso yasya kṛtinaḥ so saromāñcaḥ kāyo nayanam sānanda-salilam tam evācandrārkaṁ vaha puruṣa-dhaureyam tebhyo yama-sadana-gaty-āgati-paraiḥ. Sorry, that's a shikarani. Anyway, so he says, O earth, for as long as the moon and sun remain, may you support the pure Puruṣa-Dhaureya. So, sorry, I'll just break the reading here. Puruṣa-Dhaureya, the commentator gives a triple interpretation of this name, which refers to a bhakta. So, For now, you can just hold it as a placeholder and consider he's speaking in reference to a bhakta. But how is it that this particular name refers to a bhakta? That will be explained in the comment. And because he gives a triple meaning, I just left it untranslated. So, O earth, for as long as the moon and sun remain, may you support the pure Puruṣa-Dhaureya, or the pure bhakta, whose mind melts with delight, body haripilates, and eyes fill with tears of bliss by remembering Hari. What is the use of supporting others, those who are a burden, engaged merely in coming and going to and from the abode of Yama? So in other words, he's in one sense condemning himself and praising the bhaktas at the same time, and saying, these bhaktas deserve to live. These bhaktas ornament the earth. These bhaktas fulfill make successful all of the earth's efforts to sustain life and so forth. They are the fruition or the blossoming or the achievement of life on earth. These bhaktas, who, just by remembering Hari, they shed tears, they haripilate, their hearts become melted. So may the earth support these bhaktas upon her, as long as the sun and the moon shine. In other words, forever let these bhaktas live upon the earth in peace and prosperity, such that they can adore Bhagavan in this most endearing way. But all these other people who lack such a richness of prem, who lack such bhakti, what do they have? They're just a burden on the earth. They're just coming and going from Yamaraj. They're just, in and out of the court system, again and again, causing, clashes and causing suffering and so forth to themselves and others. There's nothing glorious in this. There's nothing fulfilling for the earth in it. It's just a burden for the earth. So, this is something of the spirit of the expression. So let's look at why the person refers to the bhakta as a Puruṣa-Dhaureya. The word Dhaureya generally means one who is fit to bear a load, and generally connotes either a bearer of some form of load, a bearer of great responsibilities, that is, a leader, and one who is most excellent. So leadership is not about self-aggrandizement. It's not about, exerting power over people for one's own aims. But leadership or greatness is based on the degree of benefit that you provide for others, the degree of support or help that you can provide for others. So a Dhaureya, or one who's capable of bearing a load, means one who can either physically hold something heavy, or more figuratively, one who can take on a great responsibility, one who can take on a burden, so to speak. And one who's capable of this, is someone who's capable to lead or be hold a position of, in one sense you could say, superiority to others, because by that person being in that position, other people will be benefited. And therefore the person is considered great or excellent. So, Dhaureya has this range of meaning. The word Purusha here refers to Sri Krishna, or more broadly Sri Bhagavan. So, if we put these two words in compound, what do we get? The compound, Puruṣa-Dhaureya, can thus refer to a bhakta, that is, a carrier of a load in the form of an order from the Purusha, meaning one who carries out various orders in service to the Purusha. So here the idea of, quote, a load or a burden is taken in the sense of one who can bear a responsibility, or one who can, take on a particular weight. So that means that they're persons who engage in service to Bhagavan. They observe the orders, the directives of Bhagavan that they receive. So Puruṣa-Dhaureya means those persons who are capable of following all of the directives of the Purusha. In other words, those who live in service to his directives. In other words, dasya bhaktas. So this is one meaning. Alternately, Puruṣa-dhaureya can be read as an adjectival compound describing a bhakta, in which case it means one whose dhaureya, that is, capable supporter, is the Purusha, Krishna. As per the statement of Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, where he says, I personally support, that is, provide the acquisition and protection of the necessities of those one-pointed, meditative, and ever-absorbed persons who worship me in full. So, ananyas chintayantamam yeyana paryupasate tesham nityabhyuktanam yogakshema vahamyaham. A very well-known statement. So, taken in this way, then Puruṣa-dhaureya means one whose dhaureya, or capable load-bearer, is the Purusha. In other words, one whose supporter, or one whose guardian, is the Purush, Bhagavan. So here in the Gita, Krishna promises that I will provide whatever is required for my bhaktas who are completely given over to me. So because they are completely given over to me, I can completely support them. So, can take it in this way, that the bhakta is the bearer of the responsibility to Bhagavan, or that Bhagavan is the bearer of the responsibility for his bhakta. Both meanings are suitable and applicable. The second aforementioned meaning of the compound Puruṣa-dhaureya suggests a higher degree of greatness on the part of the bhakta than the first meaning does, since it is indicative of Sri Bhagavan becoming captivated by the bhakti of his bhaktas. So, that Bhagavan will feel inclined to take the initiative to personally look after his bhakta, that shows that the bhakta has a place in Bhagavan's heart, or that Bhagavan has, his heart has been touched, so to speak. Whereas in the first case, where it says the bhakta follows the orders of Bhagavan, whether they've succeeded in doing that, or the extent to which Bhagavan feels inclined to reciprocate, or what would be their motivation for doing that, none of that is specifically stated in the compound. So, although we would generally read it in this context, in the ideal light, it's not necessarily implied. Whereas to say that Bhagavan is personally supporting a bhakta, that implies already that the bhakta has satisfied Bhagavan, that the bhakta has been accepted by Bhagavan, that Bhagavan regards that bhakta as a sharanagata, and so forth. So in that sense, the commentator takes the second interpretation as an interpretation that would convey or describe a bhakta of a higher stature. Thirdly, if the word Purusha is taken to refer to a person or embodied beings in general, rather than Sri Krishna, which, as we all know, the word Purush is also a word which means an embodied being, or one who's in the Pura, the word Pur. If you ever go to India, you'll drive in the town and you'll see there's Gopalpur and Hastinapur and this Pur and that Pur. Pur means a place of dwelling. So Purusha means one who's in the Pur, so meaning the dweller in the abode, or in the city, in the town, meaning the body, as the Gita describes the human body as the city of 9 gates, so to speak. So the word Purusha refers to an embodied being, or a person, that which is dwelling within an abode. So, although it can refer to Bhagavan, and often does, as we've discussed, it can also be taken in this context to refer to an embodied being in general. So, if we take it in that sense, the compound Puruṣa-dhaureya can also be read to refer to a bhakta by means of describing a bhakta as, quote, one who is excellent among living beings. So if dhaureya means a person of great capability to bear weight, and in other words, a great person of great caliber, an excellent person, so then Puruṣa-dhaureya would mean one who's excellent among embodied beings. In other words, a great person. So, in summary, as per all three interpretations, the compound Puruṣa-Dhaureya refers to a bhakta, who is simply said to be excellent, said to be engaged in carrying out a responsibility for Bhagavan, or said to have the responsibility of their well-being taken care of by Sri Bhagavan. The author so now, if we, having analyzed the compound in all of these ways, since we're reading poetry here, then we have to assume that if this, you could say, rather unusual term, or, this compound Puruṣa-Dhaureya is not, a regular way of speaking of a bhakta or something that you see in as a term in a set of scriptures or something like this. So then you have to assume that the poet chose to describe a bhakta in this way, in some way that's related to the metaphor or the image that he's trying to convey in his poem. So, what is that? Why would the poet have described bhaktas in this way? So the author likely refers to a bhakta using this compound, Puruṣa-Dhaureya, that makes reference to the action of carrying or supporting, because this is the same action the author is praying to Prithvi Devi to perform for the bhakta. So the whole idea in the verse is he's saying, may Prithvi Devi, may the earth support these bhaktas. And so there's, you could say, an enrichment to the idea by saying, may the earth support they who are always supporting or carrying the orders of Bhagavan. In other words, he is also alluding to the idea that Bhagavan is the supreme object of service. Bhagavan is this ultimate, person who is to be satisfied, and that if the earth is to support these bhaktas who are engaged in supporting, the fulfillment of Bhagavan's orders, then Bhagavan will be pleased. Or you could take it as per the second meaning. If Bhagavan is the one who's supporting the bhaktas, then, O earth, you need to support these bhaktas because, Bhagavan himself wants that. Bhagavan himself is also, there to look after and provide for these needs. So the supporting of the earth in the supplying of those needs to the bhaktas is also integral. So, my dear, Devi, please, you also contribute so that Bhagavan's desire of supporting his bhakta can be fulfilled. This can also be taken in the context. The overall sense is thus that since a bhakta supports others and is fit to be supported by Bhagavan himself, it behooves Prithvi Devi to support such a bhakta specifically. So, quote, for as long as the moon and sun remain, means until the end of the kalpa. So this, you could say, is equivalent to saying forever, but for those who, perceive the cyclic time as per described in the Shastra, you can't actually say forever. So to say as long as the sun and the moon shine means till the end of time, until the end of the, this particular manifestation. So, which is equivalent to wishing it to the nth degree, or wishing it as far as it is possible to wish it. The pure bhakta spoken of in this verse, who becomes moved just by remembering Bhagavan, such that they shed tears, horripilate, and become filled with delight, is also referred to in the singular in the verse to convey the rarity of such a bhakta. So this is also a particular hermeneutic that we see various acharyas, commentators apply, is they'll also take meaning, if you will, out of the number of the agent in the text. So if something is spoken of in the plural, then that can be for the sake of conveying abundance, it can be for the sake of conveying respect. If something is spoken of in the singular, it can also be interpreted to imply a sense of rarity or of difficulty to find or identify. So the commentator takes it in that sense, that he's not just saying, let all the bhaktas be supported by the earth. He's saying, let the Puruṣa-Dhaureya, let that bhakta who's a Puruṣa-dhaureya be supported. So the commentator is, you'd say, leaning on that edge of that singularity and saying that by just speaking of this Puruṣa-dhaureya bhakta in the singular, he's implying that not all bhaktas are like this, or, those who might, socially be accepted as bhaktas or identified as Vaishnavas for, whatever they rub on their forehead or the clothes they wear, or the temples they visit, or, conventional, standards of analysis. He's saying he's not speaking of them in general, or he's not speaking that broadly, but he wants to refer to a high grade or a special grade of great bhaktas by using this term and using it moreover in the singular. So that's how the commentator explains that point. And lastly, I'll just say that this image, if you will, of seeing, what would this compute to? If we say, okay, let's say Prithvi Devi accepted this prayer. So now what is she doing? She's doing that. So she's thinking, as long as the sun shines on me, as long as the moon shines on me, I'm going to support these special bhaktas who Bhagavan supports and who are always engaged in fulfilling the desires of Bhagavan. So when I tolerate all the, violence that's done to me, when I produce all of the flowering and flourishing and nourishment that emerges from my soils and, so on and so forth, then that is all for them. Let those rare special bhaktas that are ever given to Bhagavan, let them be nourished by all of the fruits and everything that emerges from my body, and let me undergo all the, exploitation that all these other persons who are just a burden upon me, coming and going from yama, I don't know if it's to everyone's taste, but in the modern era where, environmental devastation is on a, unprecedented historical scale, then, that she's tolerating all of that, but at the same time, she has this desire that all of her, resources and so forth ought to be used, or are best used, to support these most exalted bhaktas of Bhagavan. So to both see the quality of tolerance that she exhibits, as per the Avadut Gita in the 11th canto, the Avadut identifies the earth as a guru, one of his 24 gurus, and specifically the guru who taught him kṣama, or this quality of, you could take it as patience or forgiveness or tolerance. The word kṣama has a range of meaning along these lines. It also can refer to compassion. So the earth's, digesting or, tolerating all such exploitation, and at the same time also returning nourishment, support, forgiveness in response to that. This quality is said to be the prominent, most evident quality that one can learn from the earth. So exercising that quality is also ultimately fundamental to, or that quality is an expression of this earth as a bhakta wishing to serve these other bhaktas, wishing to nourish these bhaktas of Bhagavan. So to perceive, you could say, nature in that respect may be of aesthetic satisfaction to Vaishnavas. Okay, then let's do one more. Next, the compiler cites a bold statement describing bhakta's greatness by means of depicting their disinterestedness in mundanity. So, Tvad bhakta saritam patim chulukavat kadyotavat bhaskaram merum pashyati lostravat kimaparam bhume patim bhrityavat chinta ratnachayam shila shakalavat kalpadrumam kashtavat Samsaram trinarashivat kimaparam deham nijam bharavat. So he says, O Bhagavan, your bhakta sees the ocean as a palmful of water, the sun as a firefly, Mount Meru as a clump of earth, a ruler of the earth, that is an emperor, as a servant, thought jewels as pebbles, a desire tree, a piece of wood, samsara, a heap of straw, and what more, even their own body, a burden. I'll read it one more time. O Bhagavan, your bhakta sees the ocean as a palmful of water, the sun as a firefly, Mount Meru as a clump of earth, a ruler of the earth as a servant, thought jewels as pebbles, a desire tree as a piece of wood, samsara as a heap of straw, and what more, their own body as a burden. So in other words, they see all of this to be asar, to be insubstantial, to lack any quality that truly evokes wonder, admiration, and so forth. So, in Sridhar Samipad's comment on a verse in the 12th canto, where it's explained the purpose of why the Bhagavatam is spoken, then Shukadev, he says that Vijnana and Vairagya, to teach people these two things, this Bhagavatam is spoken. And Samipad glosses there the word Vijnan as Vishay Asarata Gyan, or knowledge of the insubstantiality of objects of the senses. In other words, awareness or arriving at the perception that there is no essence, no worthy object of attainment in the midst of all objects of the senses, meaning the totality of samsara, including everything within it, even whatever you could get from a wish-fulfilling jewel or a wish-fulfilling tree inside that domain, even the great mountains, rivers, the sun, the moon, etc. So that one comes to see all of this as trifling. Jiva Goswami begins the Bhagavad Sandarbha in a very bold way, in perhaps a similar spirit, after the Tattva Sandarbha, where he explains the old epistemological method and summarizes, how and what the Bhagavatam says. Then he starts with his core framework in the verse, Vedanti tattva vidas tattvam yajganamadvayam, that those who know the existential reality, they speak of it as a non-dual conscious existent. And what is that? Then he starts to define what is Brahman, what is Paramatma, what is Bhagavan. And to begin his definition, he starts with those who spit on all of the ananda that can be achieved even in the position of parameshti, or in other words, those who spit upon that which is the ultimate totality of desirability that could be achieved in the plane of Vishay, or in the plane of mundanity. Those persons, what they then experience as Ananda, then he starts with what is Brahman, what is Paramatma, what is Bhagavan, all of these higher things. So, one of the very, very core premises of the entire Bhagavatam, the whole culture of, Vaishnavata, is this idea that Vishay is asar. There is no ultimately fulfilling or substantial thing within it. In past, present, future, it's categorically not a possibility. This is the conviction or the conclusion that Vaishnavas arrive at, and that is what the Bhagavatam is trying to give people. It's therefore the Paramahamsa Samhita, or the text that's for the Paramahamsas, those who are only exclusively interested in an object that's by constitution transcendental to Vishay. So here, this verse is coming onto that theme, speaking about implying the greatness of Bhaktas, because they have no interest in anything of this plane. As just today in Baba's Bhagavatamrita class, he was referring to this, well-known payar in the Charitamrita regarding the Bhakti Lata, where it says, Upajiya Bhari Lata Brahmanda Bedi Jai, that as this creeper of bhakti is nourished by being watered, by hearing, chanting, etc., then it grows up and it pierces out of the Brahmanda, and it goes to Vaikuntha, etc. It reaches the feet of Krishna in Goloka. But it uses repeatedly in this section this verb bhed, which means to pierce or to cut through something. So his interpretation was that this piercing through these planes, or piercing and then crossing beyond these planes, is based on reaching a state of desirelessness for anything of that plane. It's desire that fundamentally binds, so it's only by desirelessness that one can transcend. So when one reaches the state of being desireless of anything of a plane, then one can actually adhere to a process that can lead one to experience of a higher plane. So this disinterestedness, or this desirelessness of Vaishnavas towards mundanity, this is one of their greatnesses, because it shows that it's the flip side, if you will, of their intensity of affinity and bhakti for Bhagavan, for their higher object. As we hear about in the Sindhu, one of the 9 characteristics of bhav bhakti is aruchi, or this absence of taste for Vishoy, an absence of attachment to Vishoy. So this point is emphasized in this verse, because, or rather, there is an interesting point that the commentator makes, which we'll get into, but just before I get to that, I'll just add that typically the primary characteristic of a bhakta is their bhakti. So the greatness of a bhakta is what shows the greatness of their bhakti. So here, what does this say? It just says a bhakta doesn't give a hoot about anything of the world, essentially. So you might say, well, what does that have to do with bhakti? Some jnani can also be like that. That doesn't necessarily show the greatness of these bhaktas. It just shows that they're not attached to mundanity, but other people can be like that too. So, in response to that, we would say, true. But the implication, or the assumption that should be made, is that the disinterest depicted in the verse is the disinterest that emerges from the intensity of desire and attachment to Bhagavan and to bhakti. And that it's that effect, or the influence of the intensification of their attachment to bhakti that is illustrated, or is reflected then in their detachment to the other thing. Just as by putting oneself in one space, one is not in another space, just as by putting a lot of time into one type of activity, one is also not engaging in other types of activity. Similarly, by intensifying one's desire, attachment to Bhagavan, one is also ideally, and in the case of these bhaktas, diminishing or eradicating the attachment and desire for anything else. So if the bhakta is described as being completely disinterested in anything else, then we'll take it that that's an indication of them being so one-pointed upon Bhagavan that there's no scope for anything else in that. In that way, it is a description or an indication of the greatness of their bhakti. Okay, but let's look at what the commentator says, because he makes some interesting points. Although the ocean is vast and difficult to cross over for others, a bhakta sees it to be as though a palmful of water. That is, to be of insignificant measure. Similarly, a bhakta regards other things that are widely regarded as being of great measure, importance, or value, such as the sun, Mount Sumeru, an emperor, a wish-fulfilling jewel, and a wish-fulfilling tree, to be rather no more significant than their categorical opposites. Moreover, a bhakta regards even the world of samsara itself as trivial, and their own body within it as a troublesome burden. So what they call the chid jada granti, or the hriday granti, the binding element of between spirit and matter, is this identification with the body. So to consider that not only one is not the body, but that the body is, rather than one's very self, the great object of one's adoration, rather is actually a burden. This also indicates the extent to which they are no longer identified with anything of the worldly plane. The commentator notes, however, that the manner of vision on the part of a bhakta described in this verse is one that arises on occasion, as a vyabhachari bhava, that is, a transitory emotional state that supports a bhakta's sthayi bhav, and thus such vision is not a fault. Okay, so he's saying, oh, don't think it's so faulty. Some people, they might read this and think, oh yeah, look how hardcore these Vairagi Vaishnavas are. They're so renounced, they're so great. But he's not thinking that the reader is assuming that. He's thinking that the reader is going to be going, this is a little problematic to be this completely disengaged from everything of the world. That's not actually going to be favorable to bhakti. But if it's explained that this is, a particular attitude that's prominent in the mind on certain occasions, then all right, it'll stand. He's looking at it from this angle. So since actually fostering the mentality described in this verse at all times, and to an extreme extent, would inhibit a bhakta's ability to engage in bhakti to Sri Bhagavan. In other words, if you actually literally think the body is nothing more than a burden, then you wouldn't feed it. And if you don't feed it, then how will it live? And if it doesn't live, then how will you do any bhakti? So the idea is that it's not actually that one can literally think that there's absolutely nothing of any significance to anything of the world, because if one thought that extremely and went to a state of like total nihilism, if you will, then there wouldn't even be scope left to live and to engage in bhakti to Bhagavan within that world. In that sense, he's saying, don't take this excessively extreme in the negative either. And we have evidence of this in the Bhagavatam. Sri Rupapad, in the course of his description of a bearer of eligibility for the path of Uttam Bhakti, specifies that one should be neither excessively attached nor possessed of non-attachment. Interesting right here. Na vairagya bhag. One should not have vairagya. If you have too much vairagya, you're not an adhikari for bhakti. This is straight out of Krishna's mouth. And this point is also mentioned by Rupa Goswami in his own verse. So he quotes the Bhagavatam here. Quote, "The bhakti yoga of one who is neither disinterested nor excessively attached is a grantor of success." So na-nirvinna is Bhagavan's word. You shouldn't have too much disinterest. And Rupa Goswami is saying you shouldn't have vairagya. So, okay, on the one hand, the whole purpose of the Bhagavatam is to teach vairagya, and vairagya is an outcome of bhakti, and without that, without letting go of the mundane, you'll never achieve a higher thing. That's on one side. But on the other side, if you have too much of this thing called vairagya, if it's too much disinterestedness, then that also cancels out one's ability to engage in any bhakti at all. So we need a balance. The implication is that if one fosters utter disinterest or repugnance towards objects of adoration in the world, then one has eligibility for the path of Gyan, but not the path of Bhakti, since non-attachment, or vairagya, is generally a cause of hardness of the heart that can inhibit the heart from becoming imbued with Bhakti, which is most tender by nature. So these are points made by Rupa Goswami himself in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where he says that Gyan and vairagya, they produce chitta kautinya, where they make the heart too hard. And whereas bhakti, which is made up of contemplation of the Nam, Rup, Gun, Lila of Krishna, is sukumar, it is very tender. So these two things don't go together. This hardness and this tenderness can't coexist in the same locus. So in that way, he says that these Gyan and Vairagya are not part of bhakti and not favorable to bhakti. So, we should also understand that when he then says that Vishaya aruchi, or Vairagya, is an outcome of bhakti, that's not like this same hardening effect of Vairagya in a general sense, but this outcome of bhakti, or this outcome of absorption, is the displacement of attachment or consideration for the other thing. So this is how, whenever these things are spoken of, one has to be clear both what is the type of non-attachment being spoken of and what is its underlying cause. In the context here, he says, a bhakta is thus neither excessively attached nor excessively detached from objects of the senses. The verse under discussion could be read by some to imply that a bhakta fosters total detachment from all objects of the senses, because this is understood from the compiler's teachings elsewhere to be contrary to the attitude of a bhakta. It should be understood that the detachment from the objects of the senses described in the verse is not a form of detachment that is faulty, meaning that is unfavorable to bhakti, but rather one that is a non-excessive form of detachment that arises as an outcome of bhava-bhakti, which the compiler calls virakti in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and defines as, quote, a self-manifest absence of taste for objects of the senses, and illustrates with the following description of Bharat Maharaj from Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, he who was longing for he of highest praise, Bhagavan, even in his youth, abandoned like stool, his most difficult to give up, heart-touching wife, sons, friends, and kingdom. So ya dushtajan, darasutan, viti rajyam hridi sprisha, jaho juvaiva malavat uttama shloka lalasa. A very nice statement in the Bhagavad that also is spoken to Das Goswamipad by Nityananda Prabhu at the time of the Chiradadi Mahotsav and so on. So what's noteworthy here is that Bharat Maharaj is described as Uttama Shloka Lalasa, he who has this longing for Bhagavan. That person, with this longing for Bhagavan, left all these other things. So it's not that he's just coldly analyzing them, saying, oh, there's no Ananda in this for me, forget it. It's not that he's just dryly seeing it like that, but rather, he's filled with longing for Bhagavan, and on that basis, he's abandoning these things. And even such strong language is used as to say that he's abandoning them, quote, like stool. But does that mean that we should now treat our wives and sons and friends and wealth as actual? Is that what the Bhagavatam is saying? Well, no, not really. Actually, definitely not. Don't do that. You'll get yourself in trouble. So, don't take it from me, Chakravarti Pad says, Sri Chakravarti Pad specifies in his commentary on this verse that Bharat Maharaj's wife, sons, and so forth were certainly not regarded to be like stool by anyone whose senses were not absorbed in the beauty and so forth of Bhagavan, and rather were heart-touching, that is, attractive and pleasing, and that Bharat Maharaj's detachment from them was caused only by the intensity of his longing for the sight, service, and so forth of Bhagavan, and not rather by any sense of repugnance towards them. This is a very important point, that when it says Jeho Juvaiva, Mala Vot, so this Vot, like stool, it means don't, oops, sorry, this thing cut off. Oh dear. Haribo. Hari-bol. Hari. Jai Radhe. Okay, sorry about that. So I'll just finish the point I was making, and then we can hear any feedback anyone would like to offer. So the point is that here in Chakravarti Pad's Tika, when he's saying, Jeho Juvayiva Malavat, that, Bharat left his wife and kids and kingdom like stool, then he says that it's not that anyone who didn't have the intensity of desire for Bhagavan that Bharat did would have ever perceived those things that he left in that way, which implies that they're not actually of that nature, but that it was as if to him they were fit to be left in that way because of the intensity of attachment that he had. And Chakravarti Pad elsewhere, he elaborates on this point, saying that, and it's a little bit graphic, but this is the import of what he says is that when you abandon the stool, then what are the characteristics of that, right? That if you don't abandon it, you feel some discomfort. When you do abandon it, you feel some relief. And after you've left it behind, you're not inclined to be reminded of it or to go see it again. So something like this, for the person who has this intensity of longing for Bhagavan, then if they haven't left behind these things that are obstacles to their attainment of Bhagavan, it feels like an uncomfortable pressure upon them. And when they let them go, they feel relieved to not have those pressures or burdens on them. And after they're gone, the mind isn't going and fixing itself back on them or wanting them back or continuing to think about them. The mind doesn't want and doesn't feel inclination for them anymore, just as one doesn't want to see the stool that one left behind. So all of that is meant to illustrate what is the effect of having extremely intense desire for Bhagavan. It's not meant to tell people who don't have desire of that intensity to just start thinking that their wives and kids and property are like shit, because as soon as they start thinking like that, they're also liable to start treating them like that, and then they're going to end up making, sins and offenses and just be thought of as a jerk, I mean, it's possible. I won't go into individual cases or, say that it's inevitable, but it's a scary, dangerous road to take, let's say. So the point is that he's speaking about this idea of detachment from the perspective of detachment that's an outcome of a higher desire or an intensity of desire for this greater object. And what the commentator wants to bring out in this whole comment is that what this verse in the Padyavali is describing, where Mount Meru is just a clump and the sun is just a firefly and all of this, is that the person is just totally disinterested. They're just totally, to put it in modern slang, they're over it. They don't want to be reminded and absorbed and, involved with it. They just want to pursue the object that they have. They just want to engage in bhakti. So in that respect, that attitude is praiseworthy, and that attitude is a symptom of having bhava bhakti, or having an intense desire for Bhagavan, since one-pointed desirousness, or eksprihatva, is the primary characteristic of bhava bhakti. But at the same time, on a practical level, does that mean that the person will just treat all these things without respect? No. We see that although they may be detached, although they may be not involved, although they may be distant, according to circumstance, wherever they are, they'll also know within the worldly context what is the value of something, what is the respectability of something. They'll still, observe social etiquette and norms. They don't become, as I was pointing out earlier, that it's not that one ends up just callous and disrespectful in the name of being, renounced, or in the name of being a bhakta. Rather, always there's recognition of value, recognition of, things according to context. Due respect is always shown to everything, be it objects or people or what have you. But, all of these statements about non-attachment are to depict and to show the intensity of Vaishnava's desire for Bhagavan, the intensity of their absorption in bhakti, if you will. So it's not the type of detachment that is hardening of the heart and contrary to the tenderness of absorption in Bhagavan and his Madhurya and so forth, but rather it's because of that intense tenderness and because of that rich absorption in Bhagavan that just anything else, as nice as it may be, is just felt to be other and not wanted. It just doesn't compare. It just doesn't have a place in the mind of someone who's that richly absorbed and that profoundly fulfilled. So these things ultimately emerge from absorption in the positive elements. In other words, it's not that just by doing like a dry negation of the negative, but rather by hearing, by engaging in Shravan Kirtan and all the, glory of Krishna, the glory of his Leela, the beauty of his prema, and all these things. Then, as an outcome of that, in the wake of that, all these other things are just felt to be so meager, so little, so, inferior and contrary in quality to that supreme, wonder of Krishna's prema and all the Leela that's a manifest from it, that type of disinterestedness comes about. Okay, so that was the train of thought I was on before the thing dropped. So I'll stop there. I've gone a bit over. Pardon me for going over the time. So now if anyone wants to comment or question anything on what we've discussed, please feel free.
If no one has questions, I have a question. First of all, I really like to thank you for presenting this topic so clearly, because so much misunderstanding is there on a big scale. Just give me a second, let me just go to the car. I would like to ask you about a question about yesterday's, last class, before, 2 days before, about Ekadashi, if that's okay.
Okay.
A bit about this, because Ekadashi is okay. Like I should straight question: is Ekadashi? No, how Ekadashi is part of Raganuga Bhakti, or is it or not? Following Ekadashi, Vrata.
Well, we hear in the Sindhu, in the Prakaran about Raganuga Bhakti, Rupa Goswami writes 2 verses highlighting prominent practices, in this Krishnam, Smaram, Janam, Chasya, etc., these 5 activities that he mentions. And then after that, he says, Shravana Kirtanadina, and Shravan, Kirtan, all these other 64 elements that I've listed that are part of Vaidhi Bhakti, those are also part of Raganuga Bhakti, or they're also performed by followers of the path of Raganuga Bhakti. And Chakravartipad, he, in his comment on that subject, gives a few exceptions and says that nyas and meditation on Dwaraka and a few things that are not favorable to the specific focus of a Raganuga Bhakta, those will be excluded. But he certainly doesn't mention Ekadashi on the exclusion list, and therefore, the idea is that the primary distinction between Vaidhi Bhakti and Raganuga Bhakti is the motivation for the practice, not so much the exact content of the practice. As per the text and as per the concept, the principal distinction is in the motivating element for the sadhana. So, in the case of a Raganuga Bhakta, who has the adhikar for that, and is following that path, then motivated by that, they will also follow the duties that are enjoined for the sadhaka deha in the social context of Vaishnavas, which include Ekadashi. And it's observed that Mahaprabhu, his parikaras, everyone followed Ekadashi, so they follow Ekadashi. Are they following Ekadashi because they're afraid of, sins in the grains and, dashami being contaminated with this and all of that? Maybe not. Maybe they're not highly worried about, this kind of formal injunction notice of how to avoid sin and how to, obey the orders of Bhagavan and so forth. That may not be the most prominent feature of their motivation. But, therefore, Sanatana Goswami Pad, he lists 4 reasons for following Ekadashi in Hari Bhakti Vilas, in the Prakaran where he goes on to explain all the calculation methods, etc. Then he mentions 4 reasons for doing that. And one is that it is said in the Shastra to be a fault if one doesn't. Another is that it protects one from sin. But the 4th one that he mentions is that some people do it just to please Bhagavan. Just for pleasing Bhagavan. That on the day that's specially associated with Bhagavan, they engage in extra activities that are pleasing to him. They do some extra Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, what have you. So, motivated by their aspiration for the bhava of these parikaras, they intensify their sadhana a bit on that day in some way. In that way, they, integrate it in a way that is favorable to the object of Raganuga Bhakti. And it's observed, and we see that it's, quite universally observed throughout the Gaudiya Sampradaya. There is the followers of Hidhari Vangsha and others who have,
yes, they don't.
Not taken up that or integrated that into their sadhana. They have their view, that's all right. The Gaudiyas and them have disagreed on that for 500 years, nothing new. No problem as far as I'm concerned. People will follow as they wish, doesn't bother me at all. But, in essence, that whole point comes, my understanding of it in gist, is that the idea that it's irrelevant to the sadhana of a Raganuga person and so forth, because it's not part of the way that the thing that we aspire to attain is practiced. In other words, it's not that all of the gopis are observing Ekadashi in that way and all of this. Then we can say that, okay, what is relevant to what is aspired for in the Siddha Deha, that needs to be now applied as a guideline for what takes place in the Sadhaka Deha. Maybe not. In other words, those persons have elected to make that type of application, but we see that our, Rup Sanatan, etc., they've sustained some degree of distinction in what is applicable in terms of sadhana in the Sadhaka Deha in contrast to the Siddha Deha. and Rupa Sanatana didn't favor, dressing the sadhaka deha the way the siddha deha will be dressed. They didn't, favor, adoption or emulation of all these other features of the siddha plane into the sadhaka plane. Rather, they sustained a distinction between these two planes that they didn't consider unfavorable. Rather, there was a certain formality, a certain social, physical context of the sadhaka deha, which is maintained, and what's done with the siddha deha, that's another category. That's, more private, that's, more subtle. That's not something that needs to be taken as now to inform or influence as much of the practical or literal social culture in the earthly sense. So let it be. I'm not here to argue with anyone. If people want to follow a different way as per whatever they've been taught, that's perfectly fine. But from what I've come to understand, as per the example from the Goswami's time, this, precedent was set, and, it isn't perceived to be an unfavorability.
There are a few points to this. Now, first of all, comes to mind is that the prayer of Yamunacharya, that, oh Lord, I don't know, beautiful prayer, I don't remember the Sanskrit, but he expresses that I give up all these baths and all these rituals of purity, anything that I was performing so far, I want to simply surrender to you. You remember the verse that I'm talking about? Can you recall that? He looks into his guys and all these rituals that he performed, like daily bath and sandhya and whatnot, in order to just simply focus on bhakti to Bhagavan.
Of Yamunacharya.
I think Yamuna, yeah.
There's one verse like that of Madhavendra Puri.
Oh, Madhavendra Puri, I'm sorry.
Maybe that's this Bhadram Sandhya Bastu, that one, perhaps.
Yes. So,
perhaps that's what you're referring to, okay.
Yeah, so that verse, simply, if this verse says that give up all this, when bhakti appears and the craving for pure bhakti appears, then the connotation of this is that everything else is unimportant. Just like the surrounding of this material world, Vishoy, practices, anything external that we've been doing as a sadhana, including Ekadashi, it may not be conducive anymore or irrelevant. When at one point the rasa bhakti is being tasted, and bhakta has completely oblivious to externals and following of regimented practice. So at one point, would it be at one point that bhakta would just reject all of these things? Like, why to follow Ekadashi? I have bhakti already. I mean, I'm already so intimately connected with Bhagavan. It could be an obstacle for me to do that.
Why would it be an obstacle?
Well, you have to remember to check the Panjika and check what time I have to break the fast. It becomes an external burden, and it's just like, you understand what I'm saying? It's
well, to be generous, I'll say that theoretically I accept the possibility. If someone is so intensely absorbed in their bhakti to Bhagavan that they don't have 30 seconds to look at the Panjika, if they're that intensely absorbed and their mind is not going anywhere except the Nam, Rup, Gun, Lila of Bhagavan for even 30 seconds and 24 hours a day, then I'll agree. Okay, you may be at a stature where Ekadasi is irrelevant to you. But that is exceedingly rare, if it exists at all. And, the bhakta's tendency will always be to sustain the marjada, or sustain the honor shown to the directives of Bhagavan, the directives of Shastra within society. So even if they feel it to be irrelevant to them, for the sake of social cohesion, they will observe that. And Jiva Goswami also says, in the Bhakti Sandarbha, regarding Raganuga Bhakti. He says that those who are in an initial stage and lack a large degree or much of any degree of the adhikar for Raganuga Bhakti, namely lobha, they will practice Raganuga sadhana mixed with Vaidhi sadhana. And then he says, and for those who are advanced, they will also practice Raganuga Bhakti mixed with some Vaidhi sadhana for the sake of social cohesion.
I see.
So even if someone is way up there, they still might keep up the custom just to set a good example for society, just to keep up the norms.
Okay, I understand that. So just to continue my thought, because you may think that, I may think, or someone may think that, okay, Bhakta is, maybe forget, today's Ekadashi, or forgot it, because perhaps it was in Lila, he meditation, absorption. And then it may be also the fact that Bhakta is conscientious about every single titi because of his actually broad consciousness, he's conscious of living, of life, conscious of titi. And it's obviously, today's Ekadashi titi. He will know that. Or today's, Janmashtami, today's, it will always follow the calendar, I would say. The calendar is part of the cycle of life, right? It represents the grahas, that they're servants of the Lord. So for one angle, you can argue, okay, he may forget because absorbed, he may forget about Ekadashi, but on the other hand, Bhakta is conscientious of every single moment that he lives in this world. So in the sense of, like knowing the passing days. Otherwise, I had a statement that if you don't know the day of the week, day of the month, you're a madman. Who doesn't live in a normal life of conscious passing time. But I don't know. I'm just trying to just, not pinpoint, but try to I understand your explanation is excellent. I appreciate it. But is there any possibility that the Bhakta will just be simply not out of negligence and out of, I'm talking about advanced Bhakta, not myself, that out of absorption or of Ekadashi, I forgot about Ekadashi, is that possible?
Sure, it could happen. I mean, we heard from Baba one time about our Dadu Maharaj. He was doing his smaran all the time in the cave. Sometimes he got involved in it, came out, thought, I'm going to go out for Madhukari. Came out of the cave and it was 1 o'clock in the morning. He thought it was during the day. He just lost track of time. Came out of the cave 1 o'clock in the morning. So if someone like that, in their cave, lost in their bhajan, comes out, lose track of time, it's possible, but koti virulachara koti paye. That type of sadhu is very rare.
Okay, beautiful. That's very nice. Yeah, thank you so much.
Cheers. All right.
Sorry. Okay, I won't call you. I'm thinking, thank you so much.
All right, so let's leave it at that. So we had 3 verses from this Bhakta Mahatmya Prakaranam. So we'll hear probably the remainder in our next reading. So we heard about the greatness of bhaktas shown by their disinterestedness in the mundane, their intensity of feeling even upon being reminded of Bhagavan, and them thus being prayed for to be looked after by the earth as the true fulfillment of the earth's existence and sustenance, or sustained, activity, if you will. So in this way, we've heard many beautiful features of a bhakta's characteristics, and we'll look forward to hearing more. Let these characteristics inspire us. Let us, pray for and aspire to serve bhaktas of this character, and pray that such qualities may gradually appear within our own psyche. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namo. Jai Guru, Jai Gaur, Jai Jai, Radhe Shyam.
Pranam.
Yeah.
Varna.